Welcome to SenseMaker. SenseMaker is a platform where we try and understand complicated things, and we also have conversations that shape perspective. Today, we are joined by a noted historian of China who's joining us from Berlin early in the morning. So, thank you very much to Professor Klaus Mühlhahn, who is also the president of Zeppelin University, a noted authority on Chinese history and culture, who has written many, many notable works. But the one that we'll be looking at today, you can also see it on the screen, Making China Modern from the Great Qing to Xi Jinping. Again, Professor Mulhan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, before we jump into the complicated conversation around Chinese history, that too, a very, very long perspective, tell me, as a historian of China, why this time period and why this book?
Right. Thank you so much. That's a great question to start. So I was interested, and that's the main reason why I wrote the book. I was interested in, understanding and also letting people, share in that. How can we explain China what it is today? So the origin of my interest in writing this book was trying to better understand contemporary China. And I believed it needs an historical approach to understand it. And of course, other disciplines such as political science or economists can also, of course, contribute. But I thought we better understand China's unique position in the world, but also China's unique development by looking at its history. And now China has a very long history, a couple of thousand years. And I thought, however, we have to be more precise. So I thought to understand contemporary China, we have to go back to the 16th century, when many of the institutions and structures that we see today actually originated or emerged.
One of the interesting facts about the book is that there is a certain amount of non-linearity that is built into the book. And I think that is also one of its most important storytelling mechanisms. So, of course, there is a chronology that is built into it, but then you are tracking institutions, and thereby the story that comes out is independent of just people. So, it's not about leaders, it's about the rise of institutions. I would like a comment from you before we jump into this much needed and detailed book. How have the Chinese institutions managed to stay true to form? You make a very interesting comment in the book about the Gaokao, the Chinese education examination for entrance to college. And you make a very interesting point, and I think I'm quoting you on this, that it was not something that the Chinese learned from the West. When it came to creating this mechanism, they already had something and they just pulled it out. But you're also talking about a country that has gone through a whole lot of things. And yet, there is this historical thing that they have been able to retain. How have the institutions stayed true to form?
Well, the institutions that I was interested in the book, for instance, such as the Gaokaos or the examination system to select officials for service for the state, or also, for instance, businesses, especially family businesses and companies, or other institutions, of course, are related to the government. And, for instance, economic policy, infrastructure planning, investment, and so on in infrastructure. So, and border management. So just to mention a few, because if we talk about institutions, it's often very abstract, but I was looking at very specific areas. And in institutions, the way I define it is rules that allow people to collaborate. So an institution is not an organization, but it's something that underlines an organization, underpins an organization by coming up with rules, how people, can cooperate, can together achieve certain things. And these institutions also need to be legitimate, they need to be fair, and there needs to be a certain degree of transparency. And China, and I think this has been overlooked in the West very often, That China, of course, has a very long history where these institutions evolved, emerged, but also changed. So if we want to understand China, I think it's very important to understand the gravitas of these institutions, because institutions are, so to speak, the way China has gone after certain problems and to a certain extent has been very successful. That's why they existed for so long. So for me, these institutions stay true to form because they have tradition, they have a long history, but they have also been very flexible. They were very good institutions. They were fair, they were accepted. And I think that explains their durability and their longevity.
Sorry, one of the troubles with recording online is that one has to always keep on switching between microphones. So sorry about this time lag. So thank you for kind of building in this particular perspective, because this kind of opens it up. Martin Jacques, one of the great current supporters of China, the Chinese regime, has a very interesting point that he has made often enough, and that I think you also refer to it, except yours comes from history, his comes from trying to understand secondary sources. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution in the West, in Europe, we often overlook the fact that right around that time, the Chinese state was also having its own sort of an industrial revolution, but it was powered largely by change in technology, but largely driven by humans, people. They were responsible for this amazing progress that was made in terms of GDP, in terms of resource utilization. And right around the time, 1751 is the time that you mentioned of the Qianlong Empire, when the China is at its zenith. Everywhere you looked, you had order. The elites were pretty well represented into the system of Keju or the examinations, Gao Gao as we now know them. What happened just after this particular zenith? How did a system that had everything figured out so well, we suddenly have an institutional breakdown? So I wanted your comment, but also you have a very interesting way of looking at it in the book. So perhaps a longer reference thing that perhaps the readers, or rather the people who are watching and listening to it, can then go pick up your book and find the exact answers.
Yeah, thank you. So this is for me a very interesting part of the story. So as you said, you put it very well. China was at the zenith, and then so it was a system that has worked very well, and then it declined. But what's the reason? And maybe we should go back and ask what has earlier research, said about this decline. And mostly it was interpreted, as you know, or understood by Western scholars as a sign that of cultural essentialism, or let's say, so the Chinese, so it was explained, were so beholden to their traditions of Confucianism that they were simply unable to understand the advent of the modern world. And I challenge this. I try to show that a lot of people in 19th century China or late 18th century China knew exactly that the times have changed, that they have to confront a West that is technological, at least at the same level, if not superior. And so a huge discussion and a very sophisticated discussion emerged in 20th century China of how China can catch up. But in the end, so the ideas were all there. And there was no cultural stubbornness or blindness, I would say. But what happened is, and that's my main explanation, I think, is it's political failure. So the elites, the ideas were all there, the proposals were on the table, but the elites couldn't pick them or couldn't follow them, couldn't implement them, because they were more concerned with their own power and with defending their privileges and defending their wealth. So that made them unable to make any decisions that would risk, their, so to speak, their position within society. So I explain it that China had all the cultural, economic, and even scientific conditions or preconditions to be very successful in the 19th century, but was in the end political failure that led to the decline. And so, if I may, I would like to add one sentence. What I think is fascinating, that if we compare it with our world in which we live, we also see that many problems come from political structures and political people and political processes that are no longer able to deal with the challenges. So I think what we can learn from history is that it's actually, it's actually politics that's really, really, really important. And we have downplayed it for a long time because we believe that the economy will grow and grow and grow, and modernization will lead to a better world. But it all depends on politics. And we see, of course, that also in our contemporary world.
Thank you. So, Professor, let me ask you this question, but let me ask it from a different perspective. I am speaking to you from India, and India and China both have had a legacy of colonialism. When I read your book, one key takeaway for me before we get into the 20th century, you have an entire century, the century of humiliation, as the Chinese remember it, the 19th century. We have different perspectives of colonialism. And that is something that your book also makes very, very clear. If you look at how the English, the French, and other colonial powers thought about China, and how the Chinese elite responded to that was very different than how elites in other parts of the world responded to colonialism. I would like to understand the role that the Jesuits, who have had a much longer presence in China than perhaps in any other part of the world, how they responded to it, and how the colonializing powers responded to this one state. Because what comes out from the extracts is that it was either a wonderland or it was the world's most miserable place. And did that also shape a perception of how the Chinese view themselves?
Definitely. So China enters in, let's say, if you talk about the Jesuits, which is an excellent point to make. So the Jesuits arrive in China very early, even during the Ming Dynasty. So we are speaking about the 15th and then above all 16th centuries when the first missionaries arrived there. And as you probably know, the first Christians and Jesuits were welcomed, right, by the Chinese Empire. It's actually quite remarkable. Not only were they welcomed, but also the emperor gave them important appointments at the court in Beijing. So, or before that in Nanjing. So that is really quite remarkable. I don't even know if, for instance, if you would think at that time Europe, would a European, let's say, royal family appoint an Arab or a Muslim to any position in the government? I doubt it. I can't sure if it never happened, but it certainly is doubtful. So China has entered an intense negotiation or interaction with Christian culture very early on. And the early Christians were relatively successful. I mean, the first strategy was to baptize or spread the gospel among the elite. And then later in the 19th century, it also included normal people. But it was relatively successful. But it is also at that point that China started to have some problems with Christianity, especially the more they learned about the structures, the more they learned about the belief system, the more they thought that that is actually in contradiction to some of the Chinese traditions. So from that time on, the Chinese emperor started to restrict it. But the spread of Christianity. But your question, of course, was also, did it influence the Chinese self-perception? And it certainly did. Because in this interaction, in this exchange, this very intensive exchange between Christianity and China, which was always, which was driven on the one hand by a certain openness, but on the other hand by also a certain distrust. And so that obviously formed the self-imagination of China quite a bit, namely especially because China on the one hand thought that it can enter the world, it can work with Christianity on the same level, on an equal level, so eye to eye. They didn't see themselves as inferior. So in a way, that has also influence. So this desire of China to be part of the modern world, to be taken seriously, but not automatically follow or adopt everything that is brought from the West to China, but rather being selective, being in charge of this interaction, but looking what fits China and what doesn't fit China. So China has always, rejected to simply wholesale adopt something from abroad.
That is something that comes across very well when you put it in a comparative perspective. So let me also, while we have to move to 20th century and perhaps fast forward to CCP, because there are a lot of questions that I want to ask about the Chinese Communist Party. But one last question before we say goodbye to this part of China and Chinese history in your book. Religion. You talk about the rediscovery of Confucius at this point of time. There is also a lot of interest, let me put it like that, in Christianity from different parts of China. And there is a very Chinese saying that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And I think in Christianity, this was the case because, the emperor, or rather the central control, was missing in most of the part. So Christianity was also coming up. You have Confucius being rediscovered. Things are being ascribed to Confucius today. But what about the everyday hold of religion on an average person of Chinese in descent at this point of time? What was going through their heads? We have only been looking at religion in China as often being an antithesis to the state. But your book lays down a very interesting, rather a fundamental, shatters a fundamental belief that religion played somewhat of an important role, but it was not at margins of everyday life. It played an important role, but it was not a venue of great debate like it was in 19th century, like it was in Europe, like it was in India and other parts of South Asia. But tell us about religious experience in China during this time.
Thank you for this great question. Indeed, I think, when we talk about religion in China, especially in the period that I'm investigating, and then it's already a very complicated scene. So you have many popular religions, like Taoism. You have a Buddhism, which is obviously, coming from India by Central Asia to China very early, and has an enormous following in China. You have, of course, Confucianism, although Confucianism is probably not a religion, but it does have certain religious elements to it. And you have, however, religious beliefs, such as the important role of heaven, Tian in Chinese. So heaven and sort of cosmological ideas about the development of the universe and also the earth and the human world. So all this is really complicated, and it's not coherent, but rather there have been all the time religious or religiously motivated uprisings that challenged even the emperor. So in this scene, then later on also came Christianity. In this already very complicated scene, there came later also Christianity. So it is in this context, and that's what I try to show in the book, and it's quite complicated. What I try to argue is that in this complicated situations, religious traditions or traditions of all sorts are not simply continued, but they are also reinvented and they change. So certain ideas in China, because of the contact with Christianity or colonialism or whatever you want to call it, they get a new meaning. So for instance, let's say certain ideas of Confucianism or certain ideas of Taoism become all of a sudden, they become something Chinese, which they never were, vis-a-vis the West. So here you have Christianity, Western origin, European origin, and now it encounters a Chinese religious situation, and all these religions now become Chinese religions, although there were no Chinese religions in the beginning. Yeah, there were Taoism, Buddhism, and so on, but now they become a Chinese religion. So this is just one of the ways how we can understand that traditions and religions change all the time. We shouldn't imagine them as something that is this is basically not changing, but it's changes according to new encounters or new influences from abroad. So, and I think that also explains that China really mobilized its cultural resources in order to defend itself, against, let's say, Western superiority. So it went back, Chinese intellectuals went back to the origins of their cultures to try to revive it and find vital and valuable parts in this tradition.
Thank you. You've said this now 3 times, and you also kind of stress this in the book. The Chinese state or the Chinese people and the Chinese nation, they do not take an idea from any external place and try and keep it in the way it was exported to them or imported by them. They make significant changes. Keeping to this theme, an interesting aside note to all of this is how the industrialization process is seen by the Chinese elite. And you have some remarks about it on how the sort of industries, etc., are being set up, how the entire process of modernity is being seen in this transition period. So I'm now trying to move away from the late king, and I'm now trying to get to that unstable period of Sun Yat-sen around 1911, the first revolution. But the idea of what commerce ought to be, this is a country that has played a huge role in global commerce for a very, very long period of time. But they don't understand this. And there are some comic elements also that happen because of this in the book. Tell us, what do you see in archival records when you talk about this transition to industrialization? Because how did it make sense to them? Did it make any sense to them? Or was it something that they wanted to keep away from? Because this is something I'm not able to understand at all.
I think in answering this interesting questions, it would be good to have in mind that when we always talk about China as a whole, and it's necessary, right? Because otherwise we still want to be in a conversation, and then we have to use a term like China. But on the other hand, we should not forget that China was never such a homogeneous place. It's a huge place. Even in early 20th century, it has already 500, 600 million Chinese, who live in the country. So when it comes to industrialization, different groups react differently. And this is also very normal. If you look at, a history of other countries, it's very easy to see, for instance, that those who have been employed in traditional occupations, for instance, I point out that the whole transportation sector in China, that has a huge history, right? In the cities, there were bicycles and tricycles, and people were carrying large loads. So it was on the canals, there was busy ships going up and down the canals. So China had a huge transportation, very sophisticated transportation sector, very successful, by the way. But once the railway come or the steamships come, they are a threat to these traditional occupations. So people normally would resist it, and they protested. They tried to make it impossible that, for instance, railway are constructed because they feared for their livelihood. And we see that all the time also in our world. But then, of course, there is the merchants. And the merchants, they looked at Western industrialization and they saw lots of opportunities to earn money. They said, how if we import these machines? How if we build or rebuild some of these machines? Can we not ourselves, produce electricity and so on? So they saw a lot of investment and opportunities, and they used it. And then, of course, there's also the state or the government who thinks it needs industrialization to strengthen its defense capabilities. The government has seen that militarily it can it's probably inferior to Western technology, so it needed Western technology to strengthen the country. So the first, to make China stronger. So you have different responses, and the merchants were, I believe, in the book I tried to explain it. The merchants, in some way, were extremely successful because they understood the opportunities and they used technology and industrialization and they learned from the West, but also adopted it and further developed it for the Chinese situation.
Right. That brings me to the part of China that I really enjoy. I'm an economist, but I'm also interested in China. So in 2019, I read you for the first time in China File, and you'd written on 3rd of May 2019, you'd written an article about the unfulfilled promise of the May 4th revolution. And it was a very long, very detailed essay. We are speaking 5 years later, 5.5 years later. We have had multiple COVID sort of lockdowns. We have had the white paper revolution. You made a very interesting point that 1989 was a response or a continuation of 1919. The ideas of liberty, equality, etc., have not been forgotten. Take us back to this period. The King empire more or less is over. Sun Yat-sen has come and gone. You have the instability, 1919. You have a lot that is happening. But one thing that we don't have any perspective on, and this is one question that I'm asking you now, and perhaps this will also be the question that I'll end up with. What did modernization or modernity mean to the students, the young people, the workers, and those who were the elites in China at that point of time? Because this idea around modernity has to be expanded with context of that time.
Right. Great question. So when we just talked about industrialization, and that's of course was part of what China also saw was modernity. And you just think that the first science fiction stories get written in the 1910s and 1920s. Liang Qichao writes a very famous science fiction story. And so this idea of industrial progress, technological progress, modernity, that is one complex that has obviously fascinated intellectuals. And they also saw, and there was also an ambition, of course, to say, we want to be part of the modern world. They refused to accept that they could not be part of this modern world. And they also wanted a say. And I think the May 4th movement is two things. One is a clear signal of Chinese students, intellectuals, thinkers, that they want to join modernity, that they want to have a say in modernity. And don't forget, in the book, I try to explain that the May 4th movement has to be seen in the context of similar movements, for instance, in India or in Korea, that were anti-colonial movements that called for the emancipation and so to speak, self-determination. So that's one thing. But these intellectuals were also fascinated by another idea of modernity. And I would call this is the promise of the French Revolution, right? This is liberté, fraternité. So that means, there needs to be freedom and people should be in solidarity and they should have self-determination again. So there is this political promise of a more egalitarian, of people having more say in their own affairs on a national level. So these two things are not necessarily identical, but there are two aspects of this very complicated thing that we usually call modernity. And so some young people, student protesters on Tiananmen Square in 1919 were above all fascinated of this political modernity.
It also lays waste to the claim that China has always been has always been excluded from what's going on around the world. Because you write in the book that 1919, or rather this particular period, a lot of ideas were flowing in from different parts of the world and making inroads to China. You make a very strong assertion that Chinese identity, Chinese traditions have evolved, but they've evolved keeping to their own rhythm and their own cycles. One challenge that Asian countries, African countries that were colonized have faced is the creation of the new elites. For example, the example of India, you had the creation of elites post 1858. That 1857 was the first war of Indian independence. But from 1858, you have these new elites who came up who were at home in their vernacular but who were also at home in English. The same thing happened in China, but it happened to a very, very small set of people. The Chinese language, I think it's one of the most fascinating things out there, and the culture and the repository of lores and stories is personally something I find very attractive about it. But how could the language survive an onslaught from five different colonial powers at different times during this entire 100-year period? Because the language evolves, the metaphors evolve, but the language was never at any risk of going away. It didn't matter how many people were reading the newspapers, it didn't matter how many people were reading the new stories that were being published. But the language continued on its own trajectory. And that is something very, very fascinating about China that I think you are perhaps one of the few people to comment on it.
Well, I agree with you. This is a very fascinating aspect. And I think in answering this, I would like to point out that, if you compare China to, for instance, Africa or India, or in part also, to other countries, Latin America and so on, what is remarkable is that, China never was, of course, fully colonized. But so the colonial impact was basically restricted on a few places on the coast. These were important places, such as Shanghai, or such as Canton, or such as Tianjin. But there's still the vast hinterland where the majority of Chinese lived in the countryside. And they were largely not affected. In fact, it's interesting that some people say that, while we pay so much attention to the West in China and Western influence, but we may not forget that perhaps 85% of all Chinese never had any contact with Westerners. So, and I think that's a very big difference. So you have to see China, Mao Zedong, the great Chinese leader and communist, he of course said China is a half colonial, right? A semi-colonial country. And that semi-colonial status allowed China to maintain some of its traditions, among other also its language, but also many rural traditions, cultural traditions, family traditions, because it never, because these large territories in inland China never really were affected on a large scale by the West.
Absolutely. I mean, perhaps a longer thing whenever you work on it, because the archives, etc., must be a wonderful place to trace this story. This brings me to a fact that I didn't know. As I just said, I'm an economist of this. But in your book, the middle part from 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek has taken over. Things are en route. There was a lot of co-development that was happening with Western organizations. I think you talk about the Rockefeller Foundation founding and helping the Chinese grow. There was a steady economic growth, while at the same time there was Japanese aggression. And looking at the Japanese aggression, the Chinese forces were getting ready. Why do we never hear about it? I mean, for this, one has to come to the middle part of your book. But the sense that we get, and I've read quite a lot on Chinese history, but I was pleasantly surprised with this observation in your book, because for some reason I was constantly under the impression that from 1911 to 1949, it was nothing but 38 years of nothing but desolation. But you say there were flights in China, there was air travel, there were roads, the cars were coming into it. So, what is this historical amnesia that we are never told about this in contemporary writing of China?
Well, I mean, one is, of course, that let's say that the Chinese government after 1949 had no interest in giving credit to its predecessor. So it was just in Chinese official historiography, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s are just a very, very dark age. And I think that is not true, as you have already said. I think a lot of things are happening, and the nationalist regime that is in power, especially with Chiang Kai-shek, did a lot of things that the Chinese communists could build upon. And I tried to give them some, some credit for this. And I also think that it's a remarkable age where a lot of changes are happening in China. And so for me, this is important to say that, the transition from the nationalist government to the communist government was by no means clear, foreseeable, because the nationalist government, in a way, has a lot of successes that it can show for, but it nonetheless lost the civil war. And so that is for me very important, because being defeated in the civil war does nothing to say about the policies, but it says something about that militarily, Chiang Kai-shek made some big mistakes on the battlefield. And that allowed, that led to the failure of his regime. But it was not doomed to fail from the very beginning. And in fact, it did a lot of policies that were later continued under the communists.
That is remarkable, and remarkable for two things. One, that this happened, this period of economic growth, and second, this is also true if you look at the history of the Civil War, the brief period from 1939 to 1945, when both the sides were united in trying to defeat the Japanese. Before that and immediately after that, the communists had control of the hinterland. The elites had control of the cities. But one brief question on the Civil War, and then we'll come to the modern Chinese state. Mao Zedong was not the natural leader of the Chinese Communist Party. It was the Great March, and beyond that he ends up sealing complete control of the party. Who are these other people that we ought to know about in the Chinese Communist iconography? Because they have been lost to history. Today, the Civil War starts and ends at Mao Zedong, and everybody else is on the sidelines. So, who are these people? And second, also connect Sun Yat-sen and Sun Yat-sen's overstretched influence, not just on the communists, Chiang Kai-shek, and consequently now on the Taiwanese.
Right. So, because of the very important role of Sun Yat-sen, I would argue, among others, because of his enormous influence, the policies between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, especially when it comes to industrialization, the economy, but also, for instance, Sun Yat-sen, as you know, for him it's very important what he calls people's livelihood, so that everybody's livelihood gets raised, that people have, that there is a fairness, that he wanted to end poverty, and he also wanted to end, in many ways, exploitation of workers. So there are some similarities. So my point is to say, the Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party, of course, they have a very different ideology, but there is still some overlap when you look at the concrete policies. And then your second question, actually it was your first question, but it's actually a great question. Who is the Communist Party? And we all know Mao, and here I try to write a more complicated story of this party. It's not just a party that is driven by communist ideology. In fact, Mao Zedong from the very beginning says, we have to change Marxism so that it fits Chinese circumstances. And he even, it's his great contribution is to say, also the revolutionary strategy in the West wouldn't work in China. So we have to mobilize the peasants, not the workers. We don't have a working class. Hence, we need to rely on the peasants. But that also means, this is fascinating. If you change Marxism and say, not the workers are the driving force of communism, but the peasants, but by that, you change the entire revolution. Because now it's a peasant revolution. And a peasant revolution Peasants, of course, and farmers, they have different ideas. They don't share the same, what was so important for Marx, that they are educated. The peasants weren't educated. So therefore, to make that short, the first communists, that was a really wild army, a ragtag army. There were bandits, there were prostitutes, there were impoverished, landless peasants who joined the Red Army, because that for them was a way out of total poverty and misery. So this is a communist revolution that is very different from the communist movements in Europe or in other parts of the world. So the Chinese Revolution is much more messy than we would like to believe. And apart from Mao Zedong, a lot of these people who we know by name, by the way, if we look it up, but don't come up often in the history books, are a major driving force.
Thank you. That gets me now because I'm going to club one question from 1949 to 1976. And my question has always been, there's a question I've asked to just about every historian, political scientist of China and on China that I have spoken to and interviewed on this platform. And that question has been, the revolution has happened. Mao Zedong is now the leader who has appointed Stalin as his mentor. And then he sees Stalin's influence wane in Soviet Union after he passes away in 1953. And then he creates a cult around himself. But there were other much better placed people in the Chinese Communist Party. Zhou Enlai, educated in Paris, had a much better control of the party apparatus than Mao. Why was there never any opposition to Mao Zedong?
To Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
That's also a great question. And well, I mean, we cannot say there was no opposition to Mao Zedong. In fact, I believe, and I try also to show this in the book, there was a lot of discussions. We normally, because we do not see these internal conflicts immediately, because they are very well hidden in the Chinese political system. And we, as you know, also, I mean, the access to archives is very limited from the 1950s onwards. But there are signs that there have been this constant discussions in the leadership, and there's been constant people who challenged Mao Zedong, which made him very angry over time. And in the end, I think it led to the Cultural Revolution to really try to get rid of most of the opposition. But all of this was always contested. So I think there was much more conflict, much more discussion, much more, let's say, a back and forth between the different approaches than we would normally assume.
So that is something that it does come up in the book. But every time there is opposition to Chairman Mao does something. He makes this wide gesture to the people, his people, as if he is one of the emperors that you write about in the early part of the book. So this is something that I wanted to understand. But I get your point. The archives are not open and we don't have access to them. So here is my question number 2. The Chinese state, which has always been a very powerful state at the center, every time it has exerted its power, a lot has happened, which has been very positive. Mao did leave behind a legacy of state-owned enterprises, and you show that state-owned enterprises have been the keystone, not just of the communist era, but also much before that, while Chiang Kai-shek was in power. State-owned enterprises led to the Iron Rice Bowl. And the Iron Rice Bowl led to guarantees that kept people in line and kept the elites in control of an economy. Today, the economy is in a tailspin. The usual Chinese controls don't quite work on it. And the Iron Rice Bowl Compact, which was shattered in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, is now trying to be put together by Xi Jinping. But Xi Jinping does not have that promise, that aura that Mao Zedong had on his head. Where do you see the modern Chinese state headed based on history? And I know I'm asking you a speculative question, but you must have thought about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so the Chinese, as you in your question, showed, and I think very convincingly, that the modern Chinese state is sort of torn between different ideas or concepts. And there is one, that it should guarantee a decent living to all its citizens. And it should basically extinguish poverty. Poverty should disappear, and everybody should have a minimum standard of living or be able to enjoy it. Well, that's the one thing. But on the other hand, the Chinese state is also aware that it needs to be, that it lives in a system, in a global system, a global, I'd say, capitalist system, where it needs to be successful in order to produce the sort of wealth that is needed to alleviate poverty in China and to fulfill this promise of a decent living for everybody. So, and that's where Mao Zedong failed, right? I mean, there was the iron bowl, but the iron bowl was empty, right? Everybody had guarantees, but these guarantees were minimalistic. And, I traveled to China in the beginning of the 1980s for the first time in my life. And I could see that, people at that time, they still had, certificates which they could use to get rice and meat, but the portions were extremely small. You couldn't live by it. So here's the problem. How do you fulfill this promise? You need to be successful in the global marketplace, because you need to earn the wealth so that you can distribute it. But these are two different logics. So you have one logic, which is welfarist, and you have one logic, which is, so to speak, capitalist. You need to survive, and you need to sell stuff to other countries. And so this has never been resolved in a way. China, on the one hand, wants, or needs to be successful in the global market, but it's unclear, what it does with this wealth. And if this logic then is not in complete contradiction to the welfarist logic that you can also see. So I think this is one of the biggest questions for the future, in a way. What is important? What is the priority for China? Is it growth rates, or is it equality? Is it social welfare, or is it to continue to grow its economy?
Professor, it has been a fascinating discussion. This book is enjoyable. I've read it once. I think I'll have to go back to it, read it one more time. This is something that I've learned a lot from this book. It's very well thumbed. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's a very well thumbed book. In fact, it's the first edition when it came out in India. I have a question, and with this question, I'm going to end. While I made myself towards the end of the book, you lay down the ground rule of integration of China within the modern system. There, you also have a sort of a postscript which talks about all of the things that have to be kept in mind when one is looking at institution and when one is looking at Chinese history and politics. I have a question which is not from the book. Everything else I've asked has been from the book. When I started looking into China in 2012, 2013, I came across a country that was very successful, a country that had risen up to become a middle-income country, had made an astonishing discovery. And I come in from the Amartya Sen school of debate, that is democracy good or bad, looking at China and India. But I had a different thing. When I started reading Chinese newspapers, when I started looking into the Chinese internet, the Great Firewall, and beyond the Great Firewall, I realized something very interesting. And that was, for a country that was so confident, the internal conversation in China was very negative around China. 2012, 2013, there was a book called China Stands Up. You have these bestseller books that keep on getting written about and printed about, where China is taking on the world. And now I think it's a Chinese wishes have been fulfilled. China has now got to stand up and kind of try and fight for its space. Where does this doom and gloom in China about China's position in the world comes from? Can it just be traced back to the century of humiliation? Or is it something that the Chinese Communist Party keeps reminding everybody that they are the only custodians of security? And we've seen that in the years that the book has been out, the Chinese state has gone in quite a tailspin in trying to reorient its institutions. Where is this doom and gloom coming from? How do you see the next decade in China?
So I think, this is, there are many layers to your very important question. And first of all, I would say that the world, and that includes both the corner of the world where I'm right now, Europe, the United States, but also the global South. We see a time where there's a lot of shifts and a lot of things are changing. I mean, countries like India, but also, of course, China are demanding more from the world's resources, and rightfully so. Because we have been growing up in a world where the West, Europe, and the United States laid claim to most of the world. And I think this is just, we have to be realistic about it. It also consumed most of the world's resources. It also had the highest living standards. And of course, this is not a situation that can continue. So other parts of the world want their fair share. And that is where the problem starts. Because, as we always know, it is now important to make room for these other countries, such as China, but also India and others, in the world, to come to a more equitable and a fairer distribution of the limited resources that we have on the planet. So China has been very self-confident in the recent years because it's driven by its economic success. And I think we will continue to see this in the next 10 years. China will demand an ever bigger say in world affairs. And I think it's unavoidable for a country of that economic weight and military weight that we need to accept this. So in a way, I see, unfortunately, more conflicts in the future, because I also know that in history, there are very few examples where a certain alliance or certain parts of the world actually made room for the new players. Mostly, this is not a peaceful process, unfortunately. It must have something to do with human nature. But in a way, I see more conflicts because the resources are more and more limited, whether it's water, whether it's air, whether it's economic growth. We live in an era of instability. The rules are not clear. So I think in this age, that is in the next 10 years, we will see ever more problems and conflicts in the world, also with China. And China will continue, however, to define what it sees as its right.
Thank you very much. As I said, that was my last question.